go, everyone's dancing mad. Every place you go, everyone's got it bad. There's a dance they do, they call it crazy feet. Take a chance and you will find it hard to beat.
It's magic because it's filled with rhythm and electricity. And if you've been sort of sleeping in a show, it'll wake you right up.
Let's go boom and you take me around.
I can make you mad with my feet. I can make you smile. I can make you cry, because that's the beauty of tap.
Take my word, it's a kick when you get crazy feet.
When you tap, you're everything. You're the motion and you're the rhythms. And I think that's a major art form in that sense. You got to be a dancer, but you got to be a musician.
Tap dance, at its most serious and intricate, is far more sophisticated than ballet.
If you say, and your heart, no mistake, brother, you surely got crazy feet.
If you had asked me 10 years ago, is tap going to live? I would say, I don't know. I don't know. But now I can say it is. It's alive and kicking, and it's still evolving.
Take my word, it's a kick when you get crazy feet.
Solo percussive dance. Early observers of African American dance commented on a style that became known as the Negro jig. It seemed to be a solo form, even when two dancers performed opposite each other, a competitive or display genre rooted in African tradition. A dancer or dancers showed off original or improvised steps surrounded by a circle of community members, some of whom provided music with a banjo, drum, makeshift instruments, and/or padding or clapping. When there was a shingle, wagon bed, or even specially built platform to allow the sound to resonate, dancing feet could provide their own percussion. In effect, the platform became the drum, and the feet the drumsticks. This kind of percussion became important when drums were banned in many sections of the South after the 1739 Stono River slave rebellion. Talking drums had been implicated in the planning of the rebellion, and when they were forbidden, black dancers found substitutes, among them foot percussion. The dancer's torso, as we can see from period illustrations, was often bent forward, and the knees were raised high in kicks or powerful stamps. Scuffing and sliding moves were important, as was speed. Audience members looked to the dancer's feet for fancy steps, and affirmed his or her efforts with rhythmic padding or singing, along with shouted encouragement. Occasionally, the torso was held straight and still because a virtuoso dancer was carrying a container of water on his or her head as an additional challenge.
Tap is tap dancing. It's rhythm and motion. It's what you see and what you hear at the same time. So you're dancing and you're making music.
I just think of a melody and I make the melody happen with my feet.
The noise comes from these metal right here.
The combinations are infinite, but they all come between the toe and the heel. You have metal, you have leather, you have wood, and how do those elements combine to create a certain sound or a tone?
That's your high note, your low note. You have your brush, and you have your shuffle, which is a brush in both directions. Then you have your flat, so you might do a series of toe heels, and then together is considered a cramp roll. We have riffs, a wing, push, brush, step. Right? Push, brush, step. At all times, there's sound coming out. So you have to be responsible for that sound, because if you're not, it's noise.
It is communication. It's not
Well, I had an uncle, he could do buck dance, but I just caught just a little from looking at him. He just didn't sit down and teach me. So he does his buck. He didn't do tapping. So I had a cousin could tap. So I more or less looked at him and got my little tapping from my cousin. But neither one didn't take up too much time. Whenever I see them do it, I just had to pick it up that way. Or either don't do it. It didn't take time. So, well, you got the wrong step. So I practically learned myself. So I see him, I can't do it as well as he do the buck, but he did something sort of this on the heel and toe like that. So on the heels and your toe, that is called the buck. So when you raise it up on your toes, you change it from a buck to a tap. So it goes. Buck go heels and toe. You're mostly flat-footing. That's the buck. Okay, you change it over to a tap, which is on your toes. It goes just as
I guess everybody got a different way of.
According to traditional dance expert Jackie Christian, clogging, which evolved primarily in the southern Appalachians, has English and Scots-Irish roots, and is danced with an erect upper body, on the toes, with an emphasis on down rhythms. Buck dancing, on the other hand, has African-based roots, and is performed flat-footed, lower to the floor than clogging, with more fluid body movements and an emphasis on the up rhythms, the 16th notes between 8th notes.
I told her to say that. I said, you better come out and say that. It's true. But the type of dancing that we're going to do, people they tend to call it clogging, and those are fighting words to Jackie, so I want her to sort of explain the difference.
Okay. The older style of dance in the South was called buck, and for all you folks that don't understand a Southern accent, it's like a B-U-C-K, and I've had people go home and say, Harry, come in here. Emmylou Harris is going to buck dance. So we're going to enunciate that for you, but it's buck dance, and it's a little bit different than clogging. It's the older form. It's like the acoustic music, and when you electrify it, it becomes clogging. Clogging was not even used for Southern dance until the 1930s, and that was in the square dance form. So what we're doing is a rhythm dance. It's real close to the floor sometimes, and when you exaggerate it, you really exaggerate it.
All right, so we're going to have the boys play it, and we're going to show you.
During the second half of the 19th century, rural Southern step dancing also became known as buck dancing, an American term which, like breakdown and hoedown, originated with the dancing of African Americans. As early as the 1830s, African American males were demeaningly referred to as bucks. That is how they are listed in advertisements for slave auctions, and their dancing was referred to as buck dancing. Agatha Bobino, a former slave from Louisiana, recalled the antebellum plantation dances. We have dance outdoors sometime. Somebody play fiddle and banjo. We dance de reel and quadrille and buck dance. Do men dance dat? By the 1870s, buck dancing was being featured on stage in blackface minstrel shows, and by the end of the century, instructions for buck tap dance could be found in dance manuals. 80 over time. Buck dancing, combined with wing dancing, derived from the pigeon wing and became known as the buck and wing, the precursor to modern stage tap dance. After the Stono insurrection laws prohibited black slaves from using drums in the mid-18th century, they transferred their intricate West African drumming rhythms to their bodies, specifically their feet. At about the same time, a wave of Irish immigrants, fleeing the potato famine, arrived in the United States, bringing their jigs, reels, and clog dances with them. While several European step dances had already made their way to America, Irish dancers actually toured the South as entertainers. Once slaves caught glimpses of their performances, they began incorporating the heel and toe clogging steps into their traditionally flat-footed dances, changing the simple Irish downbeat to a syncopated offbeat. But black dancers didn't adapt the cloggers' rigid postures. Their arms and torsos remained loose, relaxed, free, and so tap was born. African glides, drags, shuffles, and stamps added a distinct flavor to the evolving style.
Remember Gene Kelly, he told me, he said, tap dancing started in Ireland. I said, what the hell are you talking about? Tap dancing didn't start in. He said, yes, it did. I said, wait a minute. Tap dancing is like American art form. The Irish dance is like a clog. Tap dancing is when you put taps on your shoes, the toe and the heel, and you do rhythm and syncopation. It's different.
Slaves were forbidden by law to play drums in Jamaica, Barbados, and St. Kitts, as well as several of the colonies that would eventually become the United States. In South Carolina, for instance, slaves reportedly used drums in the Stono Rebellion of 1739. Rebel slaves, calling out liberty, marched on with colors displayed and two drums beating, pursuing all the white people they met with and killing man, woman, and child. They increased every minute by new Negroes coming to them, so that they were above 60, some say 100, on which they halted in a field, and set to dancing, singing and beating drums, to draw more Negroes to them. Following the rebellion, the Slave Act of 1740 was passed in South Carolina to prohibit the use of wooden swords and other mischievous or dangerous weapons, or using or keeping of drums, horns, or other loud instruments, which may call together or give sign or notice to one another of their wicked designs or purposes. The fact that drums are listed alongside dangerous weapons is telling. Similar rules were established in other regions. In St. John's Parish, Louisiana, for example, slaves were prohibited in 1849 from beating the drum or dancing after sundown.
The inhumane treatment says a lot, that indeed they're resisting their enslavement, that like any other human being whose rights and opportunities are being taken away, that they're going to resist and fight back.
Burning down barns was something that occurred regularly and increased during harvest time when the workload was heaviest. Poisoning could not be caught readily, and it was often something that was feared by whites even when it didn't exist.
One symptom of their fear was that there was a law that white men had to carry guns when they went to church. Sunday was the only day off for enslaved people. And so the white folks feared that the uprising, if it ever came, would happen on Sunday when all the whites were gathered in church. Therefore, the white men were required to carry their guns to church.
It was on a Saturday night, September 1739. It was a work crew. Many of them are Angolans, including a man named Jemmy, who becomes the leader.
The fated Sunday finally came on the Stono River, southwest of Charleston. And they got to a store and broke in and they killed a Mr. Hutchinson. Decapitated him and put his head on a pole and cleared out his store of guns.
It happens in harvest time, which is the time when blacks are being worked the hardest. It also happens in malaria time, and there is an epidemic going on in Charleston, which has virtually shut down the town.
They must have realized that they couldn't possibly take over the area and drive out the Europeans. But they did recognize the possibility that if they took common action as soldiers, they might be able to escape.
The governor of Florida had already issued a decree that any African who was a slave who made it to Florida would be free, and there was indeed a colony there of ex-slaves.
There is this African manned fortification, and when the Stono Rebellion breaks out, it becomes clear that what these people are trying to do is to reach Fort Mose.
People begin to join them. They burn successive plantations, kill some of the white people living there, draw some of the blacks with them. Others are afraid to join in and refuse to go. But unfortunately for them, they meet the lieutenant governor riding north.
They gave chase to him, but he was able to sound the alarm, and then of course a sort of a posse is formed, and they set out after this group of Africans.
It's an amazing moment. If they had been able to take him hostage, who knows what the dynamics would have been. These people are pursued south for a day or two. If they had been able to go another 24 or 48 hours so that more people could have joined them, their strength would have been greater, and who knows what the prospects would have been.
And the whites came on them. They surrounded these men and they fired on them. A lot of them were scattered. Many of them were killed.
Some of them escaped into a swamp, but those that they did capture, they chopped their heads off and put their heads on poles leading out down what is today US 17 out of Charleston to send a message to the other Africans. This is what will happen to you if you rebel.
After the Stono Rebellion, all of the separate laws governing slavery were consolidated into a single code. This black code restricted the movement of black people and regulated almost every aspect of the lives of the enslaved.
The crushing of the Stono Rebellion was a tragedy. To me, these people were freedom fighters. Someone like Jemmy, newly arrived from Angola, is able to show others around him that this is not the only way to live. This can change. It may not change this time, but it will change in the future.
Beginning initially on the plantations of the Carolinas and Georgia, and as the African drum band spread pervasively, Africans converted everything around them into percussive instruments. Spoons, washboards, their own bodies, hand clapping, drumming on various surfaces of the body padding juba, foot stomping, shuffling during the ring shout, and early rhythmic dance approaches that eventually emerges as African American tap dancing.
That's part of what the Middle Passage did that's quite different than how the dances might have developed on the continent, because there's so tiny room for Black Americans to maneuver socially that the embodied movement that becomes jazz takes on that much more potential, possibility, urgency.
So we arrive here and we've got this automatic sense of percussiveness in the body, and how important that became when you're also thinking about a group of people whose cultural practices were taken away from them. Now you're just who you are as a person, devoid of what your once identity was in your original country.
For slaves, their dance and their music was all they owned for themselves.
It could reach the hypnotic level of releasing them to that other place where they weren't slaves, where they were free.
The Slave Act of 1739 wouldn't allow Africans to use drums, and the reason was the revolt that was organized in this year was organized by playing drums. They communicated with each other with different rhythms. And so after that, if any African was caught playing drums, their hands were cut off. So this rhythm and this music, this spirit was then redistributed throughout the body.
Juba is a social dance that started on the plantation. What they did was use their bodies to make the sounds and to still communicate with each other and really continue that community.
So patting Juba almost immediately sets a standard for jazz as this exploration of rhythm and playful fun, but also political possibility. So information can be shared through how the rhythm is disrupted or arranged.
Drums were loud, dangerous. Whites understood them to have a military purpose, because that's mainly how whites used drums themselves, in militias. So the slaveholders attempted to keep drums from the slaves. British colonies in the Caribbean had passed similar laws, but the mainland colonies were more successful in enforcement. In the territories that became the United States, records of African drumming, so deeply connected with African dance, are much more rare. Yet no matter how effective, suppression of drums was not the same as suppression of drum rhythms. Those rhythms could be transferred to other instruments, including the body, including the feet. One might even speculate that the suppression of the drum encouraged the development of new outlets, that it created a need for tap that didn't arise elsewhere in the African diaspora.
We need to go back really to look at all of Africanist dances that were made in the circle and that were really made as a community speaking.
Percussion, a musical sound made by striking an instrument, dates back to the beginning of our history, and drumming was one of its earliest forms. Ancient African drumming was traditionally practiced in a circle, in the form of a line with no beginning or end, inspiring democratic participation with calls and responses. The drum circle was sacred. The circle formed a ritual, a blessing, a type of shared worship. It was intrinsically social, unifying. It built a community. It marked important events in their lives: births, weddings, harvests, funerals. Typically, these drum circles were accompanied by singing, clapping, and dancing, and oftentimes dancers would move in and out of the circle, demonstrating their dance skills. And when Africans were captured and transported to America as slaves, the drum circle naturally came along with them. Then in 1739, in the British colony of South Carolina, a group of African slaves planned an organized revolt. Though the rebellion was suppressed, it led to the passing of the Negro Act of 1740, a harsh slave code which included a clause prohibiting the using or keeping of drums. And it wasn't long before anti-drumming laws spread throughout the South.
Whites at the time realized that the insurrection had been planned through the use of rhythm and the drums.
Take away the drums, that doesn't mean you take away the rhythms. Rhythms can be produced other ways. They can be produced with feet and the floor. They can be produced with clapping and slapping the body. It's called Juba.
Stripped of its drums, the circle evolved to incorporate these substitutions, using the body and voice as the musical elements.
And so you have these percussive substitutes for the drum, right? You have the patting of the feet. You have juba, the patting of the body. You have clapping, that tradition of the sacred circle dance being the accompaniment, and the dancer responding to that accompaniment and then improvising on it. That's a rhythmic expression that happens very, very early on the plantation.
Around the same time, Baptist
Dr. John Wyeth, a slave owner in Huntsville, Alabama in the late 19th century, described how juba was performed. Here were accompanists who patted with the hands, keeping accurate time with the music. In patting, the position was usually a half stoop or forward bend, with a slap of one hand on the left knee followed by the right, and then a loud slap of the two palms together. I should add that the left hand made 2 strokes in half time to 1 for the right, something after the double stroke of the left drumstick in beating the kettle drum. This array of detailed descriptions of juba demonstrates a type of multiple percussion. That is, the accounts show clearly that a variety of sounds and therefore rhythms were possible from the use of the hands and feet and the various parts of the body.
Hollywood's prejudices were all the more shameful because the origins of tap were rooted in African American history.
Tap's origins go back to plantation-era practice where Christianity frowned on dancing, and the drum had been outlawed along with African dance. So the enslaved Africans found ways of making body percussion, foot percussion, using shuffle steps, syncopating steps, and found ways of moving where you weren't actually dancing in a European sense or a white sense, but you would move the feet without ever lifting or crossing the feet. So ultimately, a new form of dancing had been evolved through it, which had the rudiments or the root of tap dancing at its center.
And then you have tap dancers. Okay, I'll tell you like it is. Double fits under those spurs. You give him a step, and he not only just tap, it's what he does with it. Tap is an American form of dance, but the rhythms come from West African, the djembe drum. See, I'm like the gravel. The time step is one of the first principles of all of tap dancing, which is like the djembe drums, like a bump, 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 bump,
Djembe dance and drumming traces its roots back to the 12th century Mandinka people and was later brought to America by enslaved West Africans. But when early slaveholders banned the traditional drums, enslaved people found other ways to preserve the rhythms.
So they pick up rocks, sticks, bottles, clink, 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 to remember all this stuff. You convert those rhythms down to your feet. And everybody else wanted to get involved.
While enslaved Africans defiantly held on to and preserved their drum patterns and syncopated rhythms,
To see the profound shaping influence of the black tradition, one might begin by comparing the Irish jig or English clogging with American tap dance. The differences are essentially African American characteristics. The involvement of all parts of the body, a loosely forward stance with flexed knees, posture angled toward the earth, polyrhythmic music, closeness of the feet to the ground in scuffing and sliding steps, involvement of the hips, acrobatic moves, and improvisation. All these are Africanist. The European jig is danced in a very vertical posture, with the eyes held straight ahead. The legs and feet do all the rapid work of the dance, as the arms and hands simply dangle loosely and the hips are relatively quiet. In his 1873 pamphlet, James advises, hold the head well up, standing erect. Do not look at the feet at all, as that has a tendency to stooping, which is a very bad and ugly habit. Let the arms, the hands being open, dangle perpendicular and without straining at the sides. James's illustrations emphasize this verticality, reflecting his European values.
Early 1800s up to the 1840s, most of white performers were doing more traditional Irish jigs and reels. And
while the jig and the clog dance of the Irish moved from the knees down, its art being purely auditory, the buck dance of African Americans was more robust and full-bodied, allowing the rhythms to move up into the body and making the hips swivel and arms sway.
You know, sometimes you just got to do something for yourself. You know what I'm saying? This is one of those times for me. I just want to do something for myself. What's up? You? Oh. What can I do? I want to dance with you. Oh, yeah? Yeah. Oh, you want to do fours? Good, good. You do fours? Yeah. Is this tempo good for you? Yeah? Yeah. I'll go first. Go ahead. Thanks, man. I really enjoyed dancing with you. I've always wanted to dance with a guy like you, because you could dance.
The next piece, Trading Taps, has never failed in any country to bring the house down. For the first time, Irish dance was coupled with American tap, breaking down barriers and uniting performers and audiences. The piece climaxes in a fantastic display of harmony and fun. Choreographed by my old friend and dance partner, Colin Dunn, along with Tariq Winston, this is one of my favorite pieces from the show. So enjoy.
Tall and straight, my mother taught me. This is how we dance. Tall and straight, my father taught me. This is how we dance. Battering feet on the city street. In pools of light on street corners. The proud, bright carnival of the poor.
For white Americans, this is a new kind of body language that for them is tremendously exciting. To put your elbows out, to plant your feet flat, to be able to move your knees and your hips. It's threatening, it's scary. Some of them tell their children not to do it, but it's starting to become part of the national culture.
During slavery, the pigeon wing and the buck dance were widely performed by African Americans. When these dances were appropriated for the minstrel stage, they were billed together and called the buck and wing. As the term evolved, it included new kinds of movements. By 1900, buck and wing was used as a generic term for tap dance as well. 20th century tap dancers have described buck dancing as flat-footed tap, performed close to the floor. The buck resembled a time step, and the wing, which continued to evolve through the teens and 20s, was initially a hop and sideward thrust of one foot.
The Irish, they had a rhythm, but it was not tap dancing. And everything is from here on down. That is it. That's why they dance like that.
Tap evolved from a tool of communication to a controversial American comedy act known as Minstrelsy, in which mostly white performers would paint their skin black to imitate African American dancers.
The minstrel shows become popular because in order for a white person to dance like that, they paint themselves black by exaggerating what a black person did in dance form. And they would make money off of other people. And then they couldn't find good white tap dancers.
Minstrelsy was a curious phenomenon in which white audiences who hungered after black culture, but had disdain for and fear of the black performers themselves, opted instead to watch white actors in blackface impersonating blacks whites singing what they claimed were black songs and dancing what they claimed were black dances. This was a process that scholar Eric Lott called love and theft. It is a truism that, in this context of attempted cultural theft, the performances could never be authentic. Still, white minstrel dancers who wanted to present convincing black dances to white audiences did their best to observe and codify the constantly changing, improvisatory dancing of plantation workers and free blacks. The Negro jig or breakdown, an old generic term for a fast, energetic black dance, was a prime target.
Popular culture. But an ironic byproduct of the otherwise destructive force of the minstrel period is that the white minstrel dancers who appropriated the black dances essentially preserved the African American dance forms and the culture of the Southern slaves.
Turnabout, wheelabout, jump, Jim Crow, right? Which was this percussive dance, but it was really sort of the form of a jig. But he does it in blackface. It becomes the dance that everyone begins to copy. So you really have, ironically, this black rhythmic tradition coming through the bodies of white, predominantly Irish minstrels.
The importance of Daddy Rice is that he made African American source material popular. So all of these English and Irish white performers started asking African Americans to teach them certain dances. And that is how the minstrel show first started to develop. Of course, it's very important that these dances were saved, but they were saved in a way that we today find highly offensive.
Any trace of cultural heritage was contorted into brutal lampoon, the grotesque result of the corrupting impact of human slavery.
From the deep, deep south, where the
Part of what minstrelsy is about is African Americans having this huge influence on American culture, certainly on music and dance, but that being something that the rest of the culture is not really ready to admit.
Minstrelsy, we need to be able to look at what it really is and stop being afraid.
By 1800, jigging became the general term for this new American percussive hybrid, and it was recognized as a black, style of dancing in which the body was bent at the waist and movement was restricted from the waist down. Jumping, springing, and winging air steps made it possible for the airborne dancer, upon taking off or landing, to produce a rapid and rhythmic shuffling in the feet. Jigging competitions featuring buck and wing dances, shuffling ring dances, and breakdowns abounded on slave plantations, where dancing was encouraged and often required. As James W. Smith, a slave born in Texas around 1850, remembered after emancipation. Master had a little platform built for the jigging contests. Colored folk comes from all around to see who could jig the best. On our place was the jiggingest fellow ever was. Everyone round tries to get somebody to best him. He could, make his feet go like trip hammers and sound like the snare drum. He could whirl round and such, all the movement from his hips down. In Recollections of Southern Plantation Life, South Carolina planter Henry William Ravenel recalls the popularity of the jig during his youth in the 1830s to 40s. The jig was an African dance and a famous one in old times, before more refined notions began to prevail. It was strictly a dance for two, one man and one woman, on the floor at a time. It was opened by a gentleman leading out the lady of his choice and presenting her to the musicians. She always carried a handkerchief held at arm's length over her head, which was waved in a graceful motion to and fro as she moved. The step, if it may be so called, was simply a slow shuffling gait in front of the fiddler, edging along by some unseen exertion of the feet, from one side to the other, sometimes curtsying down and remaining in that posture while the edging motion from one side to the other continued. Whilst this was going on, the man danced behind her, shuffling his arms and legs in artistic style, and his whole soul and body thrown into the dance. The feet moved about in most grotesque manner, stamping, slamming, and banging the floor not unlike the pattering of hail on the housetop. Whenever any striking attitude was assumed or unusual antics performed, there would be shouts of applause from the spectators. Beginning in the late 1840s, use of the word jig to apply generally to black dances gradually disappears in both written and pictorial sources, and it is replaced by more specific terms for characteristic plantation dances, such as those pictured in the Breakdown and Virginia Hoedown. Some contemporary journalists link the folk dances with geographical places, applying such names as the Virginia Breakdown, Alabama Kick-Up, Tennessee Double Shuffle, and Louisiana Toe and Heel. But there is no documentation for assuming that a slave dance originated in one state rather than another. These dances were to be found all over the South. What we do note is that there was a tradition for dancers to imitate local birds and animals, such as in the dances called the buzzard lope, the Georgia rattlesnake, the pigeon wing, and others with similar names. The African jig, a black to white exchange. Up to this point, we have been concerned with the presence of African music and dancing in the New World and the impact of European culture upon them. The impact of African culture upon European music and dancing in the colonial period has been even more difficult to document, although American culture today is a living demonstration of that influence. In an era when many people were preoccupied with preserving elements of their European heritage in an alien, not to say hostile, environment, it is hardly surprising that they recorded very little of an influence which they could not publicly acknowledge. To an 18th century gentleman or lady, going native would have been as uncongenial as it was to a British civil servant in India a century later. Yet evidence has been found to indicate that these ladies and gentlemen did indeed dance Negro dances, not just occasionally but with some regularity. Usual was the term found in contemporary accounts. Not enough is known about the dance to draw any conclusions about it. At this stage, the documents must be allowed to speak for themselves. The kind of interracial gathering in which such dances might have been learned was described by Philip Fithian in his journal entry for Sunday, January 30th, 1774. This evening the Negroes collected themselves into the schoolroom, a detached outbuilding, and began to play the fiddle and dance. I went among them, Benjamin Carter, the eldest son, a quiet, studious boy of 18, and Harry, the counselor's nephew. Harry Willis, were of the company. Harry was dancing with his coat off. I dispersed them, however, immediately. 0.35. This group of Negroes, with 2 young sons of the household, were probably not dancing the minuet or even country dances. It is far more likely that the boys were learning to dance what became known as Negro jigs. About a year later, Nicholas Creswell attended a ball in Alexandria, Virginia, where he saw about 37 ladies dressed and powdered to the life. Betwixt the country dances, they have what I call everlasting jigs. A couple gets up and begins to dance a jig to some Negro tune. Others comes and cuts them out, and these dances always last as long as the fiddler can play. This is sociable, but I think it looks more like a bacchanalian dance than one in a polite assembly. Creswell's description included elements usually ascribed to African dancing, couples succeeding each other in demonstrating their ability, with the dance lasting as long as the energy of the participants. Another description was published in Dublin in 1776. In discussing the women of Virginia, the anonymous author wrote, "They are moderately fond of dancing. Towards the close of an evening, when the company are pretty well tired with country dances, it is usual to dance jigs, a practice originally borrowed, I am informed, from the Negroes. These dances are without any method or regularity. A gentleman and lady stand up and dance about the room, one of them retiring, the other pursuing, then perhaps meeting in an irregular, fantastical manner. After some time, another lady gets up, and then the first lady must sit down, she being, as the term is, cut out. The second lady acts the same part which the first did, till somebody cuts her out. The gentlemen perform in the same manner. It seems unlikely that this dance could have been the popular English dance of the 16th century, introduced in America, where they were imitated by Negroes and gradually transformed into the grotesque dances of the minstrel shows. The writers of the above reports were either English or Irish men who presumably could recognize English or Irish jigs when they saw them. Not one contemporary witness has associated the Negro jig with jigs known in the British Isles, although they use the same word for both, leading to unfortunate ambiguity. Upper-class Virginians were adopting African-American dance practices by the middle of the 18th century. One dance historian said that the practice of imitating African and African-American dance on the American stage began before the Revolutionary War. Another dance historian commented on Virginia dances in the latter part of the 18th century. There are several descriptions of the Virginia jig, all danced by European Americans who were performing their own version of what they understood to be a traditional African dance type and a refreshing change from the usual structured ballroom dances. Andrew Burnaby, traveling through Virginia in 1759, described a Virginia dance borrowed from African Americans. Towards the close of an evening, when the company are pretty well tired of country dances, it is usual to dance jigs, a practice originally borrowed, I am informed, from the Negroes. These dances are without any method or regularity. The lack of method or regularity indicates the more spontaneous and improvisational dance movements associated with African dancing. Nicholas Creswell saw a similar dance performed in Alexandria, Virginia, in 1775. They have what I call everlasting jigs. A couple gets up and begins to dance a jig to some Negro tune. Others comes and cuts them out, and these dances last as long as the fiddler can play. This is sociable, but I think it looks more like a bacchanalian dance than one in a polite assembly. It was the usual practice for a slave or servant to play for Virginia dances. So the Negro tune most likely refers to a fiddle tune with African-American origins. The everlasting jigs that resembled a bacchanalian dance had steps adopted from African Americans and were therefore new to Creswell, who was from England. The balls attended by Burnaby and Creswell were upper-class events. The rigid class structure in colonial America mimicked that of England and would have precluded common whites from attending these dances. One can infer, however, that if the upper classes were adopting African American dance practices, then common whites, who socialized with African Americans, were doing the same. Jig, a general term for dancing, continued to be used in Kentucky. However, we do not know the term common whites used for the Virginia jig. Dr. Mary Mayo observed jig dancing in the 1880s in Floyd County. Banjo picking and dancing were often seen at our elections. There would usually be one or two dancers on the floor. dancing something like a jig, classy people did not engage in this diversion. Kentucky jig dancing does not include the high steps typical of modern Irish dancing, but is characterized by steps in which the feet are usually kept low. This type of dancing has long been popular in Kentucky and is known by a variety of terms, including hoedown, breakdown, and double shuffle, all terms still in use today. The hoedown was danced on the northwest Arkansas frontier in the 1830s and in Appalachian Kentucky in the 1850s. Hoedown, breakdown, and double shuffle were used by the former slave Isaac D. Williams, B. 1821, to describe African American dance, ca. 1840 in Virginia. There are a great many white minstrel troops traveling through our northern states, claiming to give exact delineations of Negro character in plantation sketches and scenes, but they do not portray the real quintessence of old Virginia, as I have seen it. It is like a counterfeit bill to a genuine one. I have many times seen both and not to know. I've taken part myself over and over again in our southern dances and music, and danced the hoedown as well as the best of them. 25 cents was given to the best dancer of the regular breakdown. It would shake up the risibles of the most solemn individual to see the double shuffle as we did it in the old slave days. After citing various descriptions of slave dances by European observers in which the term jig is used, Epstein concludes, the writers of the above reports were either English or Irish men who presumably could recognize English or Irish jigs when they saw them. Not one contemporary witness has associated the Negro jig with jigs known in the British Isles, although they use the same word for both, leading to unfortunate ambiguity. In its usual manifestations, though, the black jig utilized all parts of the body with special emphasis on the feet, which executed complex steps as well as provided the beat for the dance, rendered in perfect rhythm. Acrobatics and speed are often emphasized in period descriptions, as are makeshift musical instruments. Several of these characteristics are mentioned in William Cullen Bryant's account of a black dance at a corn shucking in South Carolina in 1843. When the work of the evening was over, the Negroes adjourned to a spacious kitchen. One of them took his place as musician, whistling and beating time with 2 sticks upon the floor. Several of the men came forward and executed various dances, capering, prancing, and drumming with the heel and toe upon the floor, with astonishing agility and perseverance, though all of them had performed their daily tasks and had worked all evening, and some had walked from 4 to 7 miles to attend the corn shucking. The Negro jig, then, included percussion, community involvement, competition, improvisation, polyrhythms, special objects such as water jars, African movement vocabulary, and often orientation to the earth. The flat-footed style of clogging that evolved in the Appalachian Mountains was a product of the foot-shuffling square dances of Negroes on plantations in the 1700s and 1800s.
Hey, you doing, man? Where'd it go? I think you're watching him.
The old buck dance tradition of Black America that fueled the minstrel show and fueled the flatfoot dancing tradition of the mountains is still alive as it used to be.
You see the source of flat-footing in this foot-dragging, sliding, eccentric step style that peppers the dance with hot licks.
Whole chain to get started moving.
But in between those actual dance mimes. In between, those feet are talking the language of the dance to each other. And what's linking them is this complex body-based kind of polyrhythm that the African dance body style permits you to do, and that you can't do unless your rhythmic impulses are flowing from your middle body. As the whites adopted black style, they adopted to an already very ripened and very sophisticated dance style they had themselves. As you can see here, they're not so fluid in the middle body. They are a little stooped, some of them, and their arms are beginning to have that sort of loose, flowing rhythm that the blacks had. And their feet are sliding, and they're getting a lot more syncopation and a lot more tricky rhythms in because of that.
They call this mountain dance hall high up in the Smoky Mountains the stomping ground.
According to clogging authority Ira Bernstein, the American dance now known as clogging got its name in 1939, when Sam Queen's Soko Gap dancers were asked to perform at the White House for President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Queen of England, who likened the distinctive performance to the clog dancing performed in her own country.
I told her to say that. I said, you better come out and say that.
It's true.
But the type of dancing that we're going to do, people get, they tend to call it clogging, and those are fighting words to Jackie, so I want her to sort of explain the difference.
Okay. The older style of dance in the South was called buck, and for all you folks that don't understand a Southern accent, it's like a B-U-C-K, and I've had people go home and say, Harry, come in here. Emmylou Harris is going to buck dance. So we're going to enunciate that for you, but it's buck dance, and it's a little bit different than clogging. It's the older form. It's like the acoustic music, and when you electrify it, it becomes clogging. Clogging was not even used for Southern dance until the 1930s, and that was in the square dance form. So what we're doing is a rhythm dance. It's real close to the floor sometimes, and when you exaggerate it, you really exaggerate it.
All right, so we're going to have the boys play it, and we're going to show you a...
Clogging, a type of heavy-heeled dance performed on the toes and heels, often employing taps or heavy shoes to produce percussive, rhythmic effects. Of its two styles, freestyle and precision, are synchronized. The former is more recent, developing around 1930, and is often featured in team competitions and performances. See also buck dance, flatfoot. 1977 Novella Time to Dance 180. Today, clogging is a synthesis of two old-time arts, the traditional Appalachian square dance, the big circle figures, combined with the footwork of buck dancing.
And buck dancing is very similar to clogging. It comes from the same tradition, the Appalachian tradition. Now, buck dancing is a lot older, and clogging has actually evolved from buck dancing. There's a few key differences. You know, if you've seen a clogging team, they'll do matching frilly steps. They do a bunch of fancy footwork. flailing their legs around, kicking their feet up in the air, jumping up really high, and they put on a great show. And technically, even though their dance steps are in time with the music, the dancing does not contribute to the music. That's not the point. The whole point of clogging is to flail your legs around doing a bunch of fancy footwork, and when you're flailing your legs around, impressing the audience, it may or may not sound good. But yeah. And so buck dancing is completely different because buck dancing is all about playing the music with your feet. And when you're, thank you. And when you're focused on making a good beat with your feet, you don't do a bunch of fancy footwork trying to impress the audience. And for that reason, buck dancing can be very boring to watch. And so that's why, as an entertainer, I like to throw in a few clogging steps so we can have some fun. But mostly as a musician, I got to go back to boring old buck dancing in order to lay a good rhythmic foundation for this fiddle music. So I want y'all to watch close and listen. And if you see something that looks cool, that's clogging. But it might not sound as good as the buck dancing. If you see something if you hear something that sounds good, that's buck dancing, and it probably won't look as cool as the clogging. But I'm either gonna look cool or sound cool, just not both at the same time. Aww.
What buck dancing is. So without further ado, buck dancing is a traditional Appalachian style dance. Now I'm gonna assume most of y'all are familiar with clogging. Now clogging and buck dancing are from the same tradition, the Appalachian tradition, only except buck dancing is a lot older and clogging evolved from buck dancing. Now you see those two dances are very similar for that reason, but there's a few key differences. Now if you're familiar with clogging, maybe you've seen a clogging team. Maybe you've seen a bunch of dancers dressed in the same outfits doing the same dance steps at the same time. That's because clogging is most of the time choreographed. Now these dance steps are gonna be fancy. Those dancers are gonna be kicking their feet around, swinging their feet around, jumping up in the air and clicking their heels together, kicking their legs, because clogging is all about putting on a show. And in clogging, you're gonna do your dance steps in time with the music. However, the dancing does not contribute to the music, not like buck dancing. In buck dancing, it is all about playing the music with your feet. As a buck dancer, you are a musician and your feet are your instrument. It's all about playing that song with your feet. And if you're focused on making a good beat, playing that song, maybe the dancing isn't gonna be as interesting to watch. So if you've seen any of my videos, you'll see that I incorporate both the buck dancing and the clogging. So if you want to go back and look at some of my videos, watch close and listen for some of the similarities and differences. If I kick my foot up in the air, that's clogging, and it's gonna look cool, but it's not gonna sound as good as the buck dancing. Now the buck dancing, I'm gonna be creating a good solid rhythm, good solid percussive foundation for my fiddle music to set on, and it's gonna sound cool, but it's not gonna look as good as the clogging. The buck dancing is gonna be a little bit more boring. There's a few other key differences. You know, the clogging is gonna be choreographed. Buck dancing is always improvised. Clogging is often done on a team. Buck dancing is always an individual dance. Clogging is formalized, standardized. You can take clogging classes and you can learn all the dance steps that cloggers do because there's a standard way of clogging. Whereas buck dancing, you can't take a buck dancing class. Although I'm gonna get you started with a few buck dancing moves. You see, each unique buck dancer has their own unique style and their own unique set of moves and their own unique way of putting all these moves together. And I learned by watching my mentor, Thomas Maupin. He encouraged me to develop my own style, but
Here's another story. In 1842, Charles Dickens stumbles around the streets of Five Points in New York, not impressed with the ball he was given upon arrival, not impressed with anything in the city. Really. His guide has brought the party to a saloon, which Dickens calls Almack's, but which people in the district call Pete Williams's place. He's greeted by the black landlord and landlady, whose head is daintily ornamented with a handkerchief of many colors. "What will you please call for?" asks Williams. "A dance? It shall be done directly, sir." Dickens learns that this means there will be a regular breakdown. Two musicians sit on stage, a fiddler and a tambourine player, and begin to play, while 5 or 6 couples come upon the floor, marshaled by a lively young Negro, who is the wit of the assembly and the greatest dancer known. 2 of the young women wear scarves around their hair, like the landlady. Each man pairs with a woman, and they begin to dance. They continue until they've been so long about it that the sport begins to languish. Then the young dancer dashes to the rescue, joining in. The fiddler smiles and picks up the pace, sensing a new energy, a change in the atmosphere. The landlady smiles. Williams looks proud. Even the room seems brighter to Dickens. Then, single shuffle, double shuffle, cut and cross-cut, snapping his fingers, rolling his eyes, turning in his knees, presenting the backs of his legs in front, spinning about on his toes and heels like nothing but the man's fingers on the tambourine, dancing with 2 left legs, 2 right legs, 2 wooden legs, 2 wire legs, 2 spring legs, all sorts of legs and no legs. He doesn't look like he's even tired, Dickens thinks. The young man outdances his partner and finishes by leaping gloriously on the bar counter and calling for something to drink. Applause erupts across the room.
That he was an amazing musician, that his legs did things that no other legs ever did. They wrote about it in those terms, and they used the word genius.
In fact, the bright shining light in Dickens' otherwise disdainful portrayal of 5 Points is his discovery of the 16-year-old Juba in an underground saloon.
Here, too, are lanes and alleys paved with mud knee-deep, underground chambers where they dance and game. The fiddler and his friend, who plays the tambourine, are marshaled by a lively young Negro who is the greatest dancer known. Single shuffle, double shuffle, cut and cross cut, turning in his knees, presenting the backs of his legs in front, spinning about on his toes and heels like nothing but the man's fingers on the tambourine, dancing with 2 left legs, 2 right legs, 2 wooden legs, 2 wire legs, 2 spring legs, all sorts of legs and no legs. He finishes by leaping gloriously on the bar counter and calling for something to drink.
There's also a very strong sporting culture in New York at that time, and they had boxing, they had dog fights, cock fights. They also had dancing fights, these jigging contests, and Master Juba participated in those, and there would be wagers just like a boxing match.
Master Juba rises to fame through his rivalry with another great dancer, John Diamond, a white man from Boston.
Great public contest between the 2 most renowned dancers in the world, the original John Diamond and the colored boy, Juba.
Through challenge matches promoted by none other than P.T. Barnum, Master Juba beats the King of Diamonds in all but one match, thereby ensuring his reputation as the greatest minstrel dancer of the century. And in the end, Juba manages to flip the script. He travels to London and performs as a black man, playing a white minstrel, playing a black man in an all-white revue called the Ethiopian Serenaders, and gets top billing over the other 4 dancers. In the 19th
From 1848 to 1850, Juba's fame spread across the Atlantic as he toured England and Scotland with Pell's Ethiopian minstrels. The ads promoted Boz's Juba, a reference to Dickens's early pseudonym, and the playbills quoted the passage from American Notes. In a playbill cameo, Juba looks handsome, distinguished, no blackface, no wool. Another illustration pictures him in performance, snappily attired, with a cravat peeking out of his vest. His boots are shiny, with a thick heel that must have come down hard. Bending at the waist, he leans toward an upraised knee. The downward force of his hands, tucked into the pockets of his thigh-length topcoat, tugs tight the lapels. This arrested image bears some resemblance to minstrel illustrations of a breakdown, but it's inflected by an individual style. Juba looks cool. The British press reported on him in far greater detail than the American press had. More adjectives, but also a real attempt to describe. British reviewers were familiar with Minstrelsy. 2 years before, Pell's minstrels had toured Britain without Juba for a full year, garnering much press attention and a command performance before Queen Victoria. Presumably the British were also well versed in jigs, hornpipes, and double shuffles, at least in their own versions. Yet confronted with Juba, they were awestruck. The dancing of Juba, a reviewer for The Observer wrote, exceeded anything ever witnessed in Europe. The style as well as the execution is unlike anything ever seen in this country. The manner in which he beats time with his feet, and the extraordinary command he possesses over them can only be believed by those who have been present at his exhibition. The British reviewer said he was slender, copper-colored, about 5'3", and maybe 18 years old. Many tried to convey his performance as Dickens had, breathlessly. One Manchester critic spun out the following: such mobility of muscle, such flexibility of joints, such boundings, such slidings, such gyrations, such toes and heelings, such backwardings and forwardings, such posturings, such firmness of foot, such elasticity of tendon, such mutation of movement, such vigor, such variety, such natural grace, such powers of endurance, such potency of pattern, were never combined in one nigger. For modern readers, that last word is a wall, but before the paragraph slams into it, phrase after phrase piles up as if in odd imitation of unending variety. All of these marvels are done in strict time and appropriate rhythm. Each note has its corresponding step and action. Critic after critic echoed the last observation. The most interesting part of the performance was the exact time, which, even in the most complicated and difficult steps, the dancer kept to the music. The Illustrated London News noted that Juba was a musician as well as a dancer. This was praise of his tambourine playing, like many tap dancers who came after. Juba sidelined as a drummer, but the observation must have applied equally to his footwork. The Pell's Minstrels playbills stressed this auditory dimension, asking the audience to be as quiet as possible to hear the exact time he keeps with his extraordinary steps. 5 years later, in England, promoters made the most of the fact that the dancer traveling with G.W. Pell's Ethiopian Serenaders was Boz's Juba. Although the whole troupe received accolades, the press and the audiences were as taken with Juba as Dickens had been. He was noted as a youth of color. Only 18, small in stature, though trimly built, with an abundance of muscular power. Audiences in London were told they should not miss the opportunity to see the agility, rapidity of movement, and strength which is possible for a pair of human legs to be made to exhibit, and that Juba's plantation dance was especially noteworthy. But it was the Irish press who declared that however good European mimics, that is to say, white blackface minstrels tried to be, they were nothing compared with Juba. In Dublin, the Freeman's Journal wrote that no man, much less youth of European birth and habitude, could achieve the wonders of simultaneous muscular exertion as Master Juba. Indescribability. Writers struggled to find words to describe what they saw Juba do. A Brighton reviewer wrote that the effort baffles description. It is certainly original and unlike anything we have ever seen before. Another wrote of a series of steps which altogether baffled description from their number, oddity, and the rapidity with which they were executed. Writers struggled to compare Juba's steps to forms familiar to British audiences. Inevitably, the comparisons were to rural folk dances or to those of the exotic reaches of the British Empire. The dances he introduced were distinguished for eccentricity, rapidity of motion, and the accuracy of the time kept. They approximated, in some respects, to those wild dances that may be witnessed sometimes in the remoter parts of the Highlands, including the sword dance, as they're known, besides having the same idea of clanking the heels, as pervades the polka. But it is not the office of the legs alone to do all this. The head, arms, and body generally take full share of duty and assume such extraordinary positions that only a being possessed of the power of Proteus could calculate upon taking.
Eccentricity. Juba seems to have presented varied styles at different tempos during a single performance. Confused reviewers struggled to explain how he moved each part of his body independently at its own speed and how he repeatedly changed his rhythm and tone. A critic for the Morning Post wrote, "Now he languishes, now burns, now love seems to sway his motions, and anon rage seems to impel his steps." A London audience member who saw Juba at the Vauxhall Gardens wondered, how could he tie his legs into such knots, and fling them about so recklessly, or make his feet twinkle until you lose sight of them altogether in his energy. The Mirror and United Kingdom magazine declared, "Such mobility of muscles, such flexibility of joints, such boundings, such slidings, such gyrations, such toes and such heelings, such backwardings and forwardings, such posturings, such firmness of foot, such elasticity of tendon, such mutation of movement, such vigor, such variety, such natural grace, such powers of endurance, such potency of pattern." The Manchester Examiner captured something of the rhythm of Juba's performance. "Surely he cannot be flesh and blood, but some more subtle substance, or how could he turn, and twine, and twist, and whirl, and hop, and jump, and kick, and throw his feet almost with a velocity that makes one think they are playing hide and seek with a flash of lightning. Heels or toes, on feet or on knees, on the ground or off, it is all the same to Juba, his limbs move as if they were stuffed with electric wires." Percussion. The percussive sounds Juba made during his performances were another element that distinguished his dance from standard Irish jigs. Contemporary reviewers often alluded to these sounds. Playbills asked audiences to remain silent during Juba's dances so they could hear the percussion of his steps. The Manchester Guardian remarked, "To us, the most interesting part of the performance was the exact time, which, even in the most complicated and difficult steps, the dancer kept to the music." An anonymous clipping from circa 1848 said, "The dancing of Juba exceeded anything ever witnessed in Europe. The style as well as the execution is unlike anything ever seen in this country. The manner in which he beats time with his feet, and the extraordinary command he possesses over them, can only be believed by those who have been present at his exhibition." A critic in Liverpool compared his steps to Pell on the bones and Briggs on the banjo. The Morning Post wrote, "He thrills, he shakes, he screams, he laughs, as though by the very genius of African melody." Descriptions also show elements of the hand jive in his dance. Juba accompanied his dances with rapid-fire laughter synchronized to the tempo of the dance. An anonymous London critic wrote, "There never was such a laugh as the laugh of Juba. There is in it the concentrated laugh of 50 comic pantomimes. It has no relation to the chuckle, and, least of all to the famous horse laugh, not a bit of it. It is a laugh distinct, a laugh apart, a laugh by itself clear, ringing, echoing, resonant, harmonious, full of rejoicing and mighty mirth, and fervent fun. You may hear it like the continuous humming sound of nature, permeating everywhere. It enters your heart and you laugh sympathetically. It creeps into your ear, and clings to it, and all the subsequent sounds seemed to be endued with the cachinnatory quality. Well, though the laugh of Juba be wondrous, what may be said of Juba's dancing?"
And in his description, you get a sense of Master Juba's feet working along to a beat. And on the plantations, again, it was so powerful because drums had been forbidden. Drums were seen as being intimidating, as a sign of subversion, and so they'd been forbidden. So Master Juba first comes to public attention in 1842. The great English writer Charles Dickens is traveling in America, and he wants to be taken to the sleaziest part of New York, which is the Five Points. He wants to go to a cellar bar, and he very wisely asks for a police escort. So he finds himself in a cellar bar in the Five Points in 1842, and there he encounters a dancer.
Charles Dickens had written about him, and he says that Juba danced with 2 left legs, 2 right legs, all sorts of legs, and no legs at all. Dickens's description is just wonderful and magical.
and I could just read because it's so powerful. The dance commences. Every gentleman sets as long as he likes the opposite lady, and the opposite lady to him, and all are so long about it that the sport begins to languish, when suddenly the lively hero dashes to the rescue. Instantly the fiddler grins and goes at it tooth and nail. There is new energy in the tambourine, new laughter in the dancers, new smiles in the landlady, new confidence in the landlord, new brightness in the very candles. Single shuffle, double shuffle, cut and cross cut, snapping his fingers, rolling his eyes, turning in his knees, presenting the backs of his legs in front, spinning about on his toes and heels like nothing but the man's fingers on the tambourine, dancing with 2 left legs, 2 right legs, 2 wooden legs, 2 wire legs, 2 spring legs, all sorts of legs and no legs. What is this to him? And in what walk of life or dance of life does man ever get such stimulating applause as thunders about him, when having danced his partner off her feet, and himself too, he finishes by leaping gloriously on the bar counter and calling for something to drink, with the chuckle of a million of counterfeit Jim Crows in one inimitable sound. And that is the way Charles Dickens, known as Buzz, described this young black dancer. And this description really propelled the man who became known as Master Juba to fame. So who was Master Juba? Why is this so important? And the final phrase, the Jim Crow in one inimitable sound, and the talk of counterfeit Jim Crows really gives a clue to why Master Juba is important, not just for inventing tap dancing. This is the age of minstrel shows, which were very popular on both sides of the Atlantic, and they'd been made popular by a man himself of Irish origins, Tim Rice. And Rice has actually appeared in Ireland in the 1830s. The audience who came to see him were highly respectable, including the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And he sung a song called Jump Jim Crow, and so he popularised this phrase of Jim Crow. Of course, Rice was a white man who put burnt cork on his face to look like a black man. And that lay at the heart of minstrel shows, white men pretending to be black men in sometimes grotesque stereotypes, playing in front of white audiences.
William Henry Lane began to perform in taverns and saloons in the Bowery as early as age 15. And you got to think of the taverns and saloons were pretty rough and rugged places for a young black boy to dance. But if you could hold your own, if you danced so brilliantly that the room full of Irishmen set aside the notion of your color and how dare you enter this place, and do you know that you're taking your life in your hand when you come in here, then you could be championed. And so Juba began to dance around the taverns and get a reputation of being this incredible Juba and jig dancer. P.T. Barnum contracted William Henry Lane to be a competition dancer, not a stage dancer at first, but to go around challenging the house and the other dancer to the contest. If Lane lost, then Barnum had to pay both the dancer who won and the people in the house who bet against him. So pretty soon, Juba started having his own group of people follow him. Barnum then put Juba into a minstrel show, and he was the featured dancer in the minstrel show, but he had to perform in blackface so that the audience didn't know that he was a black man dancing. So Juba is a black man pretending to be a white man pretending to be a black man.
What Master Juba did was, through his dancing, he actually challenged that stereotype and that stage convention, because Master Juba's dance was so brilliant that he was allowed to appear in minstrel shows. He was the first and the only black man to play alongside white minstrel performers. And initially, he was actually managed by Barnum. And in the early days, he put black cork on his face, pretending to be a white man who was pretending to be a black man. But then he was so good, he was actually allowed to appear as a black man. And again, this was such a major challenge to the convention. A black man appearing as a black man in front of white audiences. And the phrase, "no counterfeit Jim Crow," becomes very meaningful, because here is a black man who is bringing authenticity to a performance of dance. And this is groundbreaking.
Juba's thing was to imitate all of the leading Irish jig and Juba dancers, and then combine all their steps into a finale. And so these dancers would dance first on the floor, then jump up on the bar stool, and then jump up on the bar, and then dance on a wooden block. And Juba would take that dance and he would move around like a top. So somebody starts spreading around that this lame guy is not really an Irishman in blackface, but he's a black man. And the reason why he's winning all these contests is that he's really black. He should be white throwing black and not black throwing black. You know, kind of very crazy stuff. And Juba is dropped from Barnum. John Diamond, a leading Irish figure of the minstrel show and preeminent Irish Juba jig and jump dancer, begins to challenge Wim Henry Lane. Barnum gets wind of the challenge of the two, and he comes back and he constructs at Madison Square Garden a contest.
The competition would have been, as we see, a prize fight today. Lots of spectacle, lots of build-up. Interestingly, both Master Diamond and Master Juba, who were seen as being the greatest exponents of dance, had both at one stage been managed by the great Barnum. And it seems that Barnum actually showcased a lot of these dances and in his own style actually created a lot of hype about the dancers before the competitions took place. So I do imagine that these dancing competitions were how we see prize fights today, with a lot of spectacle, a lot of anticipation, a lot of showdowns, and trash talking the opponents, and people being worked into some sort of frenzy.
Well, Madison Square Garden was not where it is today. It was closer to the Bowery, and it was not like today. We have boxing matches and basketball games. Well, they had dance competitions there. Well, in these contests, they had 5 judges. One judge would be under the stage to listen to the number of times the man's foot struck the floor within a 4/4 measure of music, how many strikes you got in a measure of music. One judge sat in the orchestra pit following the score to see how you improvise. One is looking at the audience responses, and a 4th judge sat in the balcony to look down on the pattern that you made, kind of like Busby Berkeley. And Jubas would make all of these opening roses and, you know, the different kind of imageries in time and space. And the 5th judge stood behind you in the wings to see your silhouette, to make sure that you were not using any platform or rotator or apparatus.
And people could bet on them. The dancers would bet on themselves. There was always the prize money. So there would have been a lot of excitement generated by these competitions. And the fact they were reported in the newspapers, again, tells you that these were something people took very seriously as a form of popular entertainment.
Each man put up $100 for the contest, and then the audience matched that. And then Barnum put up an extra $100 to promote that the winner gets $500. We don't think of $500 is a lot of money now, but in 1848, $500 was a huge amount of money. The dancers had to perform 2 jigs, 3 reels, and 5 hornpipes. So 10 dances to different pieces of music. Now, Diamond was known as an Irishman. His advertising was he might be white in his face and his head, but in his heart and his feet, he was a black man. So he had a lot to lose. There were 4 contests over a week. Diamond won the first contest, which was the jubilation, and he felt great going into the second contest, and they felt that Diamond's reputation would be intact, and so he was quite confident going into the second round. But Juba won the next 3 contests, and he was given the title King of all dancers, the Master Juba. Master Diamond had to step down and give his crown to Juba. With the prize money came a contract to tour Europe and Ireland with the Ethiopian Serenaders. And so Juba becomes the first Black man touring with a white minstrel company. However, he still has to perform in blackface.
Master Juba sadly doesn't live too long. We think he was born 1825, and in 1848 he travels with the minstrel show, the Serenaders, the most successful minstrel show up to that date. They travelled to Britain 1848, and in 1849 they cross the Irish Sea and they perform in Ireland in a number of venues. Everywhere he goes, he is admired. Master Juba takes top billing above the white minstrel performers. And in Ireland, the audience adore him. They're asked not to clap, but to be silent so they can hear the tap of his feet throughout the performance. And suddenly, 1851, we hear no more of Master Juba. Somebody who goes of that name appears in the English census of 1851. He describes himself as a dance teacher. He's the right age for Master Juba, but after that, Master Juba disappears.
Tap dance.
Tap dance has been around for several decades, but how did this influential art form start? And how did it become molded by history and shape and unify new cultures? Let's take a closer look. It all began with the Atlantic slave trade in the 15th century. Africans were captured and sold into other countries as slaves. Having nothing but their physical bodies, they preserved their culture by interacting through dance. Slaves also interacted with each other on plantations with drums, but owners grew wary of potential revolts and eventually restricted the use of drums in the South. This led to slaves creating new beats with their bodies, but mostly their feet in the first forms of tap. They also did this to keep their spirits up. Tap continued into the era known as Vaudeville.